Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by Riata Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? Welcome to another Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast. I think we've got a really interesting topic today. It's not exactly new, but it's a new twist on something old, and that's basically subleasing, which, of course, was exacerbated by the pandemic when people started saying, I have to go home. What do I do now? But a new twist on it that we're seeing is subleasing. So people came in and subleased from an original tenant, and then maybe they go under, their needs change, they need more space, they need less space. So they want to sublease their sublet.
It's a sublet.
Explain to us how that works.
Sublet. Well, it's interesting because, what sparked us to do this episode, this topic, was a BizNow article where they were quoting somebody who said that the amount of sublease space in North Texas has increased by 2.1% and to over 10 million square feet in the second quarter of 2023. I thought that was kind of funny in a way because, I've been very skeptical of all quotes that say we have less than 10 million square feet of sublease space available on the market. Because as I look at it, the number of square feet has been somewhere between 8 and 12 million square feet, depending on who you ask. And I also think there's a huge amount of shadow space, which is space that's still leased but not being used, that will not be kept when the lease extends. A good example of this is down in Houston. It was just announced that a major company signed a lease for their headquarters. I think it was a big oil company, and they're leasing half of the amount they currently lease, for the new term. So here and now, I don't know if that's, I think they lease like 440,000 square feet now, and the new lease is going to be just over 200,000 square feet. And I don't know how much, if any, of their 400 and something thousand square feet has been on the sublease market or not. But my point is that that's shadow space. And even if they had space on the market for sublease, it probably wasn't 200,000 square feet. It was probably something less. We can give away these 5 floors and, but that was, 70,000 feet or something. And so that's, the extra 30,000 feet that's not on the sublease market, but occupied, is what I call the shadow space that's really not needed, but still being, quote, used by that company. So anyway, in this article, the increase in sublease space was partially credited to what you talked about in the intro, which is companies that have already subleased their space. Now the subtenant is trying to sublease their space. They don't need the space anymore either.
And landlords love this, right? Trying to remember how.
Well, so, one of the questions is that legal?
Yeah.
And the answer is probably not. Every sublease consent document or even sublease agreement that I've seen specifically says that the subtenant has no right to further sublease the space to someone else. And I've actually had this a few times in my career where we represented a company who subleased the space. So we represented the primary tenant that was subleasing her space. And then that subtenant wanted to sublease the space. Well, our client didn't care. And, but whenever we went to take that to the landlord said, no, we're not going to approve that. And we're like, well, why not? And part of the reason was they just didn't feel comfortable with who that subtenant was. They kind of feel like it's getting so far removed from their sense of control and involvement that they wouldn't really be able to control what happens in the space, and they were just nervous about it. We had another situation where we represented a company in a building that needed to expand, and the only option for expansion was subleasing space down the hall. So the primary tenant sublet the space to our client, who's also a tenant in the building, and the landlord approves it. Everybody's happy. Well, our client, who's now the subtenant in that situation, decides, yeah, we're not going to use that space after all. So we put the space on the market to sublease it. And we found a party who wanted to do that. Well, the landlord was totally on board. They were fine signing off on that. But the primary tenant said, no, we're not going to approve that. And we're like, why not? Why do you care? And they're like, yeah, we just don't want to mess with it. They actually said, we don't really have any real reason. We just don't want to mess with it. Once we sublease the space, we've written it off of our books, and we just don't want to mess with it. And so that was just the end of that sublease scenario. So in both of those situations, a subtenant was actually found ready to take the space. And in both cases that got rejected, one by the landlord, one by the primary tenant.
So what you're saying is a sublease is always harder than a sublease.
I guess it depends on what you mean by harder. It's not necessarily
harder to get negotiated, harder to get approved by
harder to get the approvals.
Okay. Well, there's more people to get approval from.
Exactly. There's just more cooks in the kitchen, which means that souffle is not going to puff up the way it should.
Oh, I like all your references. And now I'm hungry. Can you finish this by yourself so I can go
Suddenly
eat?
I'm Julia Child. Anyway, there was another situation where I was the landlord. So back when I was on the landlord side, we had a client, a tenant who occupied 2 full floors, and they no longer needed the space. And this was 25 years ago, probably. And so we approved the sublease that when a subtenant came along, but the subtenant was building a building of their own to move into. And so they weren't building their own building. A company, they had signed a lease for a new building that was under construction, but it had like 2 years left. Well, our lease with our primary tenant had 4 years left on the lease. Well, so they had to sublease the full term. And once that full term or the 2 years was ended and the subtenant moved into their new building, they then wanted to sublease the space. And so now I'm on the landlord side, and the landlord in that case said no. And the reason the landlord said no in that situation was because the subtenant that was brought for us to approve was a company that also only needed the space on a temporary basis and was not going to stay in the building beyond the end of the sublease. And that was key in my view. Most landlords, I think, that have any smarts about them are going to want the space occupied with somebody who wants the space. And they have some shot at keeping that tenant at the end of the lease term, sublease term. The primary tenant's not going to keep the space because they're already subleasing it. They don't need it. They moved out. So why would they keep it? The subtenant, on the other hand, has a real strong possibility of staying there because, 80% of companies under a certain square footage anyway, renew their leases instead of moving. And landlords know that. So if I approve this lease, sublease, sublease, as long as I have some idea that it's not for a reason that will automatically move the tenant out of the building, then I'm going to approve that because now I have a shot at keeping somebody, and that keeping somebody in a space is almost always cheaper than trying to go find a new tenant for the same space.
It's a lead gen.
Well, it's the downtime. Once a tenant moves out, then you got to go market the space to get a new tenant. How long is that going to take? 6 months, 2 years, ever right now. TIs, commissions, et cetera. So yeah, it's all free rent. So it's always way more expensive for a landlord to find a new tenant than to keep the one they've got. So anyway.
Well, this sounds like the key thing a lot of these people are looking for is flexibility. So why aren't you just going to WeWork, Caddo, Spaces, Regis? That they're totally set up for that. Why wouldn't they go there instead?
Well, for one, it's a whole lot more money. I mean, so let's just say you have a building where the landlord's quoting $30 a square foot. when you look at the real cost per square foot with a Regus or a WeWork or any co-working situation, it's a lot of money per square foot.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that's because flexibility is expensive. And they have all the extra amenities and the common areas and the kitchens and all that kind of stuff, the conference rooms. And so you're paying your pro rata share of all that effectively. So, the actual square footage cost per square foot in that situation might, instead of being 30, it might be 60 or even more. Whereas in a sublease, it's usually 20 to 40% cheaper than whatever the primary tenant's paying or whatever is being quoted in the building at the time. In a sublease, that could even go lower, because anytime somebody's trying to get rid of their space, they're just trying to stop the bleeding of the rent payments. So if they're paying $30 a square foot and they can get somebody to come in and pay 25, well, hey, having a $5 loss is a whole lot better than a $30 loss.
Right.
And then that goes down to the next level. So instead of paying, 25, they're going to be able to pay $5, and now the subtenant's only paying 20. And I'm making numbers up, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But so anyway, so subleasing or subleasing is much cheaper in most cases than going to one of those flexible office solutions.
So what happens when you have a large company, General Motors, or I don't know, somebody really large, vacate all their space or at least a full floor or something like that, and you put it on the sub market or the sub market? Do you lease out the full floor to one person? Can you go ahead and cut that up? How does the main landlord look at their tenant or subtenant, creating a whole new floor plan?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we do deal with this a fair amount. In fact, I was on a lengthy call yesterday afternoon because we have a client, which is a big international company that's great credit. And we were looking at floor plans, talking about how do we sublease the space, because they actually have 2 wings that are available currently, but they've decided to continue leasing or occupying one of those, or portion of one of those wings. So here we have a full wing available, 20,000 feet, let's call it. And then the next wing over, there's another 20,000 square feet, but a portion of that is sort of a big common break area. Mm-hmm. And so they were like, all right, so we could get rid of this space up on this side of the floor and this space on the other side of the floor. And I said, yeah, but how are you going to get to your space? Because, when you looked at the 2 spaces, mm-hmm. it goes from wall to wall or from glass to glass, and there's no way to get through it to get to their space, which means we have to build a common area corridor, which is expensive because you have to be able to get to the restrooms. You have to be able to get to mm-hmm. the fire stairwells. And so we're like, we'd be better off moving it from on the south side of that floor to the north side of that floor. But even in that case, we're still going to have to build the common corridor. It wouldn't be as extensive in that situation. But so there a lot of complexities that come into it when you start splitting up a larger space. We had the same thing in Fort Worth. We have a client that has a space in Fort Worth. It's about 11,000 square feet. And when it came time to extend their lease, they really didn't want the whole space. They only wanted to keep maybe 2/3 of it. But the problem was, because of the way the floor was set up, if they took 2/3 of it, there was no way to get to the remaining third.
It's transit.
It was stranded space. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was physically no way to do it the way the building was set up. So mm-hmm. in that case, they were just going to have to take the whole thing, or they were going to have to move. And so it's just, when a landlord's looking at that comes into play into their decision in approving a sublease, or the primary tenant and the landlord in a sublease request, as to whether or not they approve it. Who's going to pay for that work? What is it going to look like after it's done? I mean, like, after the sublease is over, mm-hmm. they move out potentially. Now,
looks like a maze.
What are you left with? If you think if you're better off with it, great. But if you're not, then that may be a reason you say no.
Okay. So does the major landlord look at the credit worthiness of subtenant, subtenant when the original tenant is still on and is liable for the lease, regardless of what happens with the sub or subtenant?
That varies. I would say that it's incumbent on a subtenant to underwrite the credit of the primary tenant, because if you move into a sublease space as the subtenant and you're paying the primary tenant, but then the primary tenant is not paying the landlord, they're just pocketing the money.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? The landlord's going to ultimately terminate that primary lease. And when you terminate the primary lease, it automatically terminates the sublease. So you want to underwrite the credit of the primary tenant to make sure that they're going to be sort of sticking around. That kind of takes care of itself, however, because if a company is not creditworthy in the first place, they may not even try to sublease. They may just walk away from the lease and they're done. And so if a company's in the process of subleasing it and they're having to pay the rent in the meantime until it gets sublet, then that's kind of a qualifying action by itself, because they have the wherewithal to continue to pay the rent on space they're not using. And they may have gone out and leased some additional space that is appropriate for their use. So I think it's important for the subtenant to underwrite the credit of the primary tenant, although that's not as big a deal usually as the other way around, the primary tenant underwriting the credit of the subtenant. I have seen far more situations where the subtenant flakes out than the primary tenant flakes out. I think I don't, in fact, in no transaction I've ever been involved with over the last 40 years, have I ever seen the primary tenant flake out on a deal once it's happening. Now, does the landlord care about the credit of the subtenant? That varies a lot. I have had landlords approve subleases and never even look at the credit of the subtenant. I've had others that say, yeah, send me over the financials of the subtenant. I want to see that. And we're like, why? You got, behemoth company, whatever, great credit, international, credit. Why not, bond equivalent credit kind of thing. So why do you care? One of the reasons that landlords care in that situation is because they are looking to what I talked about earlier, which is hopefully that subtenant will become a direct tenant. So they don't want to put a crappy credit tenant in there, because then it's like, well, do we even want to keep them at the end of the sublease? So that's one reason they might want to do that. Second reason is they'll argue is, well, if the subtenant's not creditworthy, then they're not, even if they can pay the rent, they may not have the money to pay for other upkeep needed in the space. And therefore they let the building kind of go down and become in ill repair. And therefore we don't want to approve it because we don't feel that's good for the building.
Yeah. Okay. So, let's talk about logistics. If the subtenant is in the space and it's working fine, but the light bulb goes out, the elevator's not working, there's something they need. Do they contact the subtenant who contacts the primary tenant who contacts the property manager, or can the sub go directly to the property manager? How does all that work for the person, for boots on ground?
Negotiable. Okay. So it's kind of funny. There's the Texas Association of Realtors have a standard form, air quotes, standard form of a sublease. And one of the provisions in there says, check this box if the subtenant is going to have all of its communication through the primary tenant, or check this box if the subtenant can interact directly with the landlord. So, it's negotiable. I would say in most cases, in practical terms, the subtenant pays the primary tenant pays the landlord, because they're not the same dollar amounts. But when it comes to things like, hey, it's too hot, it's too cold, I need a new badge for my new employee, whatever, I need to change the names in the directory. A lot of times then the subtenant does that directly with the property management office. So it just kind of, it depends on it's a case by case basis. Throw in a subtenant now, again, it's negotiable and it may vary. I mean, my argument is that a smart landlord wants to have as much direct contact with the subtenant or the subtenant as they can. Number one, because they want to make sure the space is being maintained properly, if the tenant's even responsible for that. And number two, they want to be able to start evaluating that company for future potential negotiations on a direct basis. So, if I was the landlord, I'd want to have as much direct interaction as I can get. But, I still want to know that the primary tenant is on the hook for the money.
Solid. Yeah. So what does all this subleasing do to the asset itself? Does the lender go, "Ooh, I don't like the way this is looking. I'm going to start calling your note"? I mean, how does the lender and landlord's relationship change when the building starts turning into a sub-market type deal?
Well, I think that really depends on the loan covenants on the mortgage documents. So it could be in some cases where, let's just say you have a building and the whole building's occupied by ExxonMobil. And then ExxonMobil moves out and they're now trying to sublease the building and it gets sublet to a startup company that just happens to need a bunch of space. Well, is that building worth the same amount of money as it was when ExxonMobil was there? I don't think so. And the reason is because even if the subtenant stays there, they're not going to have ExxonMobil credit. So when you look at the credit worthiness of a company, let's say ExxonMobil can go out and they can raise money by selling bonds with a 4% interest payment on them, or interest rate. Not today, but pre-COVID anyway, pre-inflation, they could do that for 4%. Well, a startup company that goes out and tries to get the same amount of money, or even far less money, any money at all, might have to pay 6 or 7 or 8% interest. And that's because they're less credit worthy. So the same thing is the case for buildings. A building is often valued based on the income it generates, the probability of that income continuing, which, that's where credit worthiness comes into play. You got ExxonMobil, you got 100% chance that the rent on the lease is actually going to get paid. Joe Blow startup, do you have 100% chance? No, you have maybe 70% chance, maybe 50% chance. Who knows what it is? So if you're looking at the probability of the future income stream, it's far less with a startup company that doesn't have a credit history. Therefore, that could affect your ability to get a loan on the building or to even sell the building at a price you want. A good example of this also is Walmart. So not too far from where we live, Walmart had a store and it was sort of interior to the city. It was not on a major highway and they had a long-term lease on it. Well, then they decided to go build a new store, bigger store on the highway itself. And they vacated this old one. Well, they still were paying the rent on that building, but it's now called shadow space. It's not, it's dark. There's nobody occupying it. Well, then you go sublease it to someone else. It's still a dark building. The tenant cannot count on the Walmart credit paying the rent beyond the expiration of the lease that exists. So if you have 8 years left on the lease, well, you can be guaranteed you're going to get great payments from Walmart for 8 years, but what about the 9th year? It's totally a crapshoot. So an investor is not going to pay the same thing for that as they will for a building that Walmart still occupies, has renewal options, and still only has 8 years left on the lease.
Okay. Well, just can you kind of encapsulate all this and tell what the significance of this sublease trend is going to do for the office market in the next 2 to 4 years?
Sublease in general or sublease?
Both.
Both. Well, when there's a lot of subleases out there, it gives companies that are looking for space a lot of options. And it puts downward pressure on rental rates because it's additional supply. So Dallas-Fort Worth, we have 420 million square feet or so of office space inventory. Occupied, not occupied, doesn't matter. Just total inventory built on the ground, 420 million square feet approximately. Well, if we have 80 million square feet of that vacant and ready to be occupied by somebody, whether it's direct space or sublease space, and now that goes up from 80 million to 100 million, that's more supply, more options for the tenants that are still using office space. Therefore, that puts downward pressure on the rental rates. That's what's so confusing about this market right now, is that rental rates really haven't gone down. Now, the effective rates have gone down because the concessions have been higher, but even those have been tightened up on. And so it makes no sense that with such a lower demand requirement and still having new supply built with new buildings being built, why aren't our rental rates not going down? In the top Class A trophy properties, it makes sense because there is still plenty of demand for that. Companies are trading up to that, like the company we talked about earlier that went from 400 and something thousand square feet to 200,000 square feet. They can easily pay 50% more rent per square foot and still save a ton of money because they're occupying half the space. So the top end of the market in terms of quality is doing well. It's the lower end of the market, the B and C buildings, Class B and C buildings, that are really hurting for occupancy. But even those have not been dropping their rental rates like they should have. And part of the reason for that is because of the loan covenants, again, their lenders may not allow them to reduce the rents because now the income coming in may not even cover the mortgage payments. So it's a very difficult and confusing time right now. And so the more sublease space that comes on the market and the more leases that expire and renew or move to a new location occupying less square footage than they've leased in the past, all that's going to continue to put further pressure on rental rates to go down, on building values to go down, and it's going to make it more difficult to refinance the buildings, especially with interest rates being so much higher than what they had been. I mean, they're double what they used to be, really. So all that is going to conspire together to make the life of landlords pretty crappy for a very long time and give tenants a lot of options. So they need to be considering that. They need to be hiring a good, experienced real estate advisor to help them navigate that. That would be you, my dear. And so, if they're not going to hire us, shame on them, but please go hire somebody else.
Right.
To help them out and to go out and find those opportunities.
Navigate the waters.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I'm sorry, one last thing, underwrite the credit of your landlord.
Like we said, we have to refer to that. Have to look up what number podcast that was, but we had a whole podcast just on that.
Yep.
But thank you for the insight. And as always, we wish our audience well, and give us a call if we can be of help in any way.
Adios.
Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.